Adana woke up before sunrise, as she always did. The kitchen tiles were cold beneath her bare feet, and the morning air carried that damp, heavy silence only found in emotionally empty homes. She quietly moved around the kitchen, preparing yam porridge and egg sauce, Desmond's favorite, or at least it used to be, when they were still newly married. Back then, he'd thank her, kiss her cheek, and tease her for always waking up too early. But those days were gone, buried beneath layers of pride, resentment, and Desmond's growing obsession with status. He had changed. Somewhere between his promotion at work and his sister Nkechi's constant visits, he had begun to look at Adana like she was beneath him, a burden to carry, not a woman to love. As she stirred the pot and set the table, her phone buzzed quietly. It was her father, Chief Leopold, checking in. "Are you okay?" the message read. She stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back, "Yes, Daddy. I'm still watching over him like you asked." Desmond emerged from the bedroom like a king descending from a throne. Dressed in his corporate shirt and well-pressed trousers, he looked sharp, on the outside. He walked past the dining table, barely glancing at the food, and instead picked up his car keys. "You're cooking again? Don't you think it's time you got a real job, Adana? You sit at home, doing nothing while others are building empires," he said, without looking at her. The word stung, not just because of their cruelty, but because she had given up a managerial job at one of her father's companies to marry him. She wanted a humble life, to love without money being the center of it all. But Desmond no longer respected her sacrifice. He saw her simplicity as laziness, her silence as weakness. As he walked out the door without a bite or a thank you, Adana sat at the table alone, slowly eating her breakfast in silence. The tears she blinked away tasted like salt and regret. Later that day, Adana visited a nearby pharmacy to pick up some medication for her recurring migraines, which had worsened over the past few months. The pharmacist, a kind woman named Ifioma, had come to recognize her. "You don't look well, my dear," she said gently. Adana offered a weak smile. "I'm fine. Just tired," she whispered. But inside, she was anything but fine. The weight of her marriage, the burden of pretending, the silence of suffering, it all pressed on her like a hand over her throat. She remembered the promise she made to her father before marrying Desmond, that she would try to make the marriage work without revealing her background, to ensure Desmond truly loved her. But now, she was beginning to wonder if it was a mistake, because the man she had married no longer saw her. He only saw what she didn't have, or what he thought she didn't have. And every day, that lie was starting to bury her alive. Desmond walked into his office that morning with a strut that had become second nature. His colleagues greeted him respectfully, some with fear in their eyes. He had recently been promoted to departmental team lead, and he wielded his new title like a sword. But what Desmond didn't know was that his promotion had little to do with his performance. It had been carefully arranged behind the scenes by the very man he would one day disrespect, the silent owner of the company, Chief Leopold Nwankwo. Desmond had no idea who truly controlled the strings. All he knew was that things were finally going his way, and it only added to his delusion that he was self-made. As he entered his private cubicle, his phone pinged with a message from HR. "Your additional allowance has been approved." He grinned smugly, snapping his fingers, as if he had just conquered a kingdom. "Omo, I too much," he muttered to himself, spinning in his chair. Meanwhile, in a quiet boardroom several floors above, a man in a gray native kaftan sat alone, reviewing files. Chief Leopold tapped his pen on Desmond's personnel file, his face unreadable. "Still the same boy," he murmured to himself. It wasn't the first time he had tried to protect his daughter from heartbreak, but this situation was worse than he had feared. Adana's silence worried him. He had expected Desmond to mellow with time, to grow into a man worthy of the quiet jewel that was his daughter. Instead, Desmond had grown more arrogant, more entitled, believing he'd earned everything he had through brilliance and effort. Chief Leopold had stayed away from public eyes for years, building empires in silence. He didn't put his name on the door, didn't speak at conferences. Power, he believed, didn't need to announce itself. But now, watching Desmond rise by riding on a lie, and watching Adana suffer silently. He was nearing his limit. Still, he needed proof. One final test. And then consequences. That evening, Desmond came home in high spirits. He tossed his suit jacket on the sofa and called out to Adana, who was in the kitchen washing plates. "Guess who's officially the boss now, eh? Your husband. I told you I was going places." She smiled faintly and congratulated him, handing him a glass of water. He took it, sat down, and began scrolling through his phone. All these people doubted me. Now look at me, driving a Toyota Camry, working in the biggest firm in Lagos. And it's not your broke family that helped me. I did this myself. The knife in Adana's hand trembled slightly. She said nothing. She had paid off his car. She had personally asked her father to intervene at the company when Desmond's name came up for review. And yet, she remained invisible. She washed the plates in silence, the only sound in the house being the splash of water and Desmond's laughter as he scrolled through his phone, praising himself. It was Nkechi's idea to host a small get-together in their apartment. "You know, to celebrate your promotion," she had said with a sly grin. Adana, as always, quietly agreed. Nkechi had moved in under the guise of looking for work in the city, but her true mission seemed to be making Adana's life miserable. The night of the gathering, Desmond was all smiles as he entertained a few friends and coworkers in their modest living room. Music played softly in the background, jollof rice and fried chicken were served, and bottles of malt and wine littered the table. Nkechi was the loudest among them, sipping wine and scanning the room like she owned the house. At one point, she turned to Adana, eyeing her up and down. "Sister-in-law, no necklace, no bracelet, not even earrings? Is this how wives of team leads look these days?" The guests laughed. Desmond laughed too. Adana managed a small smile and excused herself to the kitchen, her heart pounding. She stood in the kitchen pretending to wash an already clean plate, her eyes brimming with tears. The insult wasn't new, but tonight it was public. And what hurt the most wasn't Nkechi's words, it was Desmond's laughter. He didn't defend her, didn't even flinch. She had done everything for him. Car, rent, hospital bills for his mother, job promotion, all through her silent sacrifice. And this was her reward. As she quietly composed herself, a gentle knock came at the back door. Wiping her face, she opened it. There stood her father, Chief Leopold, dressed simply in a brown senator outfit and leather sandals. "Daddy," she whispered, startled. He gave her a small smile. "I heard you were celebrating." "I came to see for myself," he said softly. She hesitated. "Desmond doesn't know who you are." Her father's eyes twinkled with calm power. "That's the point. Let him meet me without the crown." She nodded and led him in through the back. Chief Leopold sat in a corner, unnoticed, quietly observing the room. The laughter, the mockery, the pride, all of it played out before him like a stage. Desmond was in full performance mode, talking loudly about his job, his future, and his plans to build a mansion by 40. At one point, he said, "I just need to cut off some people weighing me down. Some wives are liabilities, not partners." The room laughed. Adana's stomach turned. Her father didn't say a word, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. He watched as his daughter served food, cleared plates, and smiled through humiliation. And he made a silent vow. If Desmond failed the next test, the upcoming dinner, he would burn every illusion the boy had built and return him to dust. The morning after the gathering, Adana sat on the edge of the bed, quietly folding laundry, while Desmond got dressed for work. His mood was light, still buzzing from the night before. He adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, glanced at her briefly, and chuckled. "I hope you learned something from Nkechi last night. You need to step up your image, babe. People are watching us now," he said smugly. Adana didn't respond. She folded his white shirt gently, thinking about the man who had sat quietly in the corner, her father, Chief Leopold, and how he had seen everything. She remembered the tightness in his jaw, the calm but cold way he observed Desmond's prideful display. She knew something was coming, but she wasn't ready yet. There was one last opportunity, one final moment for Desmond to redeem himself, even if he didn't know it. So she took a deep breath and said, "I want us to have a family dinner this weekend. Just a small one. You, me, and my father. Desmond raised an eyebrow. Your father? Since when do you talk about that man? I thought he was some broke pensioner hiding in the village. His tone was dismissive, laced with that arrogance that had become his signature. Adana swallowed her pain and replied softly, He's been reaching out. I feel like we should give him a chance. Just dinner. Desmond scoffed. Well, I hope he doesn't come here to beg. I don't feed grown men, especially ones who let their daughters marry into nothing without even bringing yam or cola to greet the groom's family. His words stung, each one like a slap to her silent dignity. He didn't know that it was her broke father who paid for their wedding, who covered the bride price through a third party, and who arranged the wedding reception venue behind the scenes. She had hidden her family's wealth to protect the purity of their love. But now she questioned whether there was ever love in the first place. Still, she kept her voice calm. It's just one dinner. Please. By Friday evening, she sent her father a text. Come to dinner. This weekend. Please dress simply. He still doesn't know who you are. Her father responded with a single word. Understood. That night, Adana sat on their balcony alone, watching the Lagos skyline flicker in the distance. The sounds of traffic and life moved below them, but her world felt still, suspended in the quiet before a storm. She thought about the years she had spent covering for Desmond, the rent he never knew she paid, the hospital bills for his sister, the new TV set she bought in his name. He believed he was a self-made man, a rising king. But in truth, he was an emperor built on sand. Sand she had held together with her bare hands. She wondered what her father would say if Desmond insulted him again. She feared it, but she also hoped for it. Because sometimes, truth must slap a man in the face for him to wake up. And if Desmond was going to slap fate, then fate would slap back. The day of the dinner arrived with rain clouds and quiet tension. Adana cleaned the house more thoroughly than usual. She changed the curtains, set out the good plates, the ones Desmond had said were too fancy for everyday use. She even lit the vanilla-scented candle her father once gave her and placed it in the corner of the living room. She dressed simply but neatly, wearing a soft lilac gown with matching earrings and light makeup. She looked like peace itself, calm, delicate, and composed. Desmond wore a starched white senator outfit and expensive wristwatch, strutting around the house like he was hosting a press conference. I hope this man doesn't come here to embarrass us, he muttered. Nkechi, lounging on the sofa with plantain chips, rolled her eyes. You should have told him to come with drinks and not empty hands, she said with a smirk. Adana bit her lip and said nothing. The tension curled around her like smoke. At exactly 6:30 p.m., there was a soft knock on the door. Adana opened it, and there stood her father, dressed simply in a clean but modest brown kaftan, black slippers, and a calm expression. Good evening, my daughter, he said. She hugged him gently and whispered, Whatever happens tonight, thank you. He nodded. Desmond stood when he saw him, but didn't smile. So this is a man, he asked, sizing Leopold up with disdain. Welcome, sir. You can sit anywhere. Leopold nodded politely and took the seat closest to the balcony. The dinner began in silence. Adana served jollof rice, grilled chicken, and pepper soup. For a while, the conversation stayed surface level. Lagos traffic, politics, weather. But Desmond's ego could not stay quiet for long. He started boasting about his promotion, the staff under him, and how he planned to build his first duplex in Lekki by 40. You see, hard work pays, sir, he said, sipping wine. Unlike some people who spend their lives depending on their daughters for survival. Chief Leopold raised an eyebrow slightly, but said nothing. Adana's heart thudded against her chest. Desmond continued, These days, people feel entitled. They don't work, but they want respect. They can't even bring a tuber of yam to thank the man feeding their daughter. Nkechi laughed. Some people just sit around expecting favors from son-in-laws. It was a moment of growing cruelty. Adana's hands trembled slightly as she served water. Then Leopold finally spoke, his voice calm, deep, and deliberate. It is pride that makes a man spit on the very hand that feeds him, because he thinks the hand is dirty. But he forgets it is that hand that holds the gate to his future. Desmond's face twisted. "What does that mean?" he asked harshly. "Are you trying to insult me in my house? Let me warn you, sir. I don't care who you think you are. This is my home. My rules." Chief Leopold stood slowly, his expression unreadable. And Desmond, in a move so foolish it echoed into the soul of the room, spat directly at his feet. "Leave this house and never return," he growled. For a full 10 seconds, the room was silent. Even the ceiling fan, spinning lazily above, seemed to pause in disbelief. Adana's eyes widened, her throat tightening in horror. Her heart dropped as if gravity itself had shifted. Chief Leopold did not flinch. The spit landed just inches from his sandals, a thick insult that soaked into the tiled floor like a curse. He didn't react with anger, nor did he respond with pride. He simply looked at Desmond with the quiet sadness of a man who had seen the end of something long before it began. "You are a man," Leopold said softly, "but you are not a husband, and certainly not a son-in-law." His voice carried more weight than a slap. Nkechi hissed from the corner, "Why is he speaking in riddles?" Desmond barked, "I said get out of my house, old man, before I call security." Leopold's eyes finally turned to Adana. Their gaze met, father and daughter, and no words were needed. She knew what would come next. He picked up his walking stick, nodded once, and walked out. As the front door closed, Desmond let out a triumphant scoff. "That will teach him to show respect," he said, sitting down and pouring himself another drink. "You see, Adana? That's what your kind respects. That old fool has no shame, begging for relevance." But Adana was frozen. She stood by the dining table, hands clenched, tears forming behind her eyes. She was tired, not just of the abuse, but of the blindness, of how a man could mock the very person who was holding up his life from the shadows. That man had just spat on his boss, his silent benefactor, her father, and he would pay for it, not because karma moves fast, but because karma never forgets. She excused herself and walked to the bedroom, locking the door behind her. She pulled out her phone and sent a short message. He spat. "I have no more excuses for him." Her father responded in 2 words. "Now I act." That night, Desmond slept like a king, legs spread across the bed, dreaming of power and promotions. But Adana sat awake on the edge of the couch in the living room, unable to sleep, unable to breathe. The house that once felt like a home had become a battlefield of egos, silence, and silent bruises. She knew the wheels had turned. Her father had been patient, too patient. But the moment had come, and Desmond would wake up to a world where everything he believed was real would start to fall apart. One thread at a time. She whispered softly to the night air, "God, give me strength." Not to fight for her marriage, but to survive the storm that was about to cleanse her of it. The house was still the next morning, too still. Adana moved slowly as she tidied up the aftermath of the dinner, clearing the dishes, wiping the tiles where Desmond had spat, folding the chair cover that had fallen during his outburst. Every movement felt like an echo inside her chest. She wasn't angry. Not anymore. She was just empty. Her hands moved from habit, but her heart was somewhere far away, back in her childhood home, where her father used to say, "A man who disrespects himself will one day think disrespect is power." She had held onto the hope that Desmond would change, that love and patience would melt the ice he carried inside his chest. But last night had shattered all illusion. The man she married had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He spat on her father, not just literally, but symbolically. He had spat on everything that had quietly sustained him. And now, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the silence before a building collapses. Desmond strolled into the living room later that morning like a man who had just won a battle. He whistled as he flipped through his phone, then noticed Adana kneeling and scrubbing the floor where the spit had landed. "Still cleaning up after your father's mess?" he asked with a mocking smile. "That man better not show his face here again." Adana didn't respond. She continued scrubbing, not because the floor was dirty, but because something inside her needed to erase that moment. Desmond's voice grew louder. "You should be grateful I tolerated him. In fact, you should thank me. Some men would have thrown both of you out by now." She stood up quietly, wiped her hands, and looked at him. Not with fear, not with pleading, but with calm clarity. "There's nothing left to thank you for," she said. Her voice wasn't raised, but it cut deeper than any scream. Desmond blinked, surprised by the firmness in her tone. "What did you say?" he asked, stepping forward. She didn't flinch. "You've disrespected the wrong person, and soon you'll understand." That afternoon, while Desmond was out, Adana packed a small bag, not to run away, but to visit her father. She needed peace. She needed clarity. She arrived at the quiet estate where Chief Leopold stayed, a gated house tucked inside a hidden part of a koyi, shielded by silence and tall mango trees. The security men let her in without a word. Her father was waiting in the courtyard, seated on a wooden bench, sipping zobo from a clay cup. "I've been expecting you," he said as she approached. She collapsed beside him and rested her head on his shoulder like a tired child. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything." He didn't scold her. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just held her hand. "You did your part," he murmured. "Now I will do mine." And he will learn that not all fathers are weak. Some simply choose silence to test the hearts of those around their children. Adana closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she felt safe. While Adana sought peace in her father's arms, another scene was unfolding at Desmond's workplace, and he had no idea. In a brightly lit boardroom on the 10th floor, several top executives sat around a polished mahogany table, reviewing a sealed document marked private and confidential. It bore the letterhead of the company's silent shareholder, Chief Leopold Nwankwo. The letter was brief but powerful. It outlined concerns regarding the character of one Mr. Desmond Obi, citing verbal abuse, arrogance, and a disturbing incident involving a guest in his home, who happened to be the majority stakeholder in the company. The board members were stunned. Most of them had never met the elusive Chief Leopold, only heard whispers about him during high-level audits. For years, he had managed his investment in silence, never interfering in operations. But now, he was activating his authority. He demanded a full investigation into Desmond's conduct both professionally and privately. The board members looked at each other and knew someone was about to be made an example of. Back at his desk, Desmond was oblivious to the hurricane gathering around him. He was too busy gloating over the congratulatory messages from last week's promotion. He made a video call to Nkechi, bragging about how everyone was finally recognizing his greatness. "Soon, I'll be the face of this company," he declared. Nkechi clapped and blew kisses at the screen. "We made it, bro. Poverty can never touch us again." Desmond laughed like a king on a throne. But just as he ended the call, his phone buzzed again, this time a formal email from Human Resources. Subject: Meeting notification. Immediate compliance required. Desmond blinked, confused. He clicked it. The message read, "Mr. Obi, please report to conference room 3B at 2 p.m. for a scheduled review of your conduct. This meeting is compulsory." He scoffed. "What nonsense is this?" he muttered. "Who wants to question me?" But deep inside, something unsettled began to twist in his stomach. He didn't like surprises, and this one felt serious. At 2 p.m. sharp, Desmond entered the boardroom. The atmosphere was heavy. HR was present. Legal was present. A few unfamiliar faces from the compliance department also sat around the table. "Please sit," the HR director said. Desmond obeyed, trying to maintain his confidence. "What's this about?" he asked. The director opened a file. "There have been multiple concerns about your professional attitude, as well as some troubling reports about your behavior at home. Allegations of disrespect, manipulation, and verbal misconduct." Desmond's jaw dropped. "What? From who? Where are these lies coming from?" The director didn't flinch. "Unfortunately, these reports have been submitted to the board by a source with direct ownership interest in this company. A silent partner you may not be aware of." Desmond's heart skipped. "Silent partner?" he repeated. "Who?" But no one answered. They only handed him a folder. On the cover was a letter and a watermark, LN Group Holdings. Desmond stared at it, unaware that the very man he spat on had now placed his fate in writing. Desmond stormed out of the boardroom an hour later, his head pounding and pride in tatters. The conversation had been brutal, not in tone, but in truth. They had asked questions he couldn't answer. Is it true you've mocked your wife's family in public? Have you ever used company assets for personal glory? Is it appropriate for a newly promoted staff to speak to clients as if he owns the organization? He had fumbled through half-truths and angry denials, but the paper trail was undeniable. His emails, his voice notes, even screenshots of rude internal chats were compiled in that damning folder. And worst of all, they said he was under performance review by order of the primary investor. He didn't know who that investor was, only that they carried terrifying weight. Desmond's arrogance began to crack. He returned to his office, slammed the door, and sat in his chair like a man who had been slapped by an invisible hand. "Who's doing this to me?" he whispered. He was no longer sure he was in control. He paced the office floor like a trapped animal. He thought about Adana, her quiet ways, her lack of reaction when he insulted her father, the calmness she maintained through every storm. Could she have reported him? Could she have connections he didn't know about? But that couldn't be. She was from a poor background, right? She had no friends in high places. Just her old father and some weak relatives who didn't even show up after the wedding. Still, something nagged at him. He remembered the man from dinner. There was something about his eyes, calm, commanding, dangerous in their stillness. Who was he really? Why did he speak like someone who owned buildings, not just bones? And why did HR say the complaint came from someone with direct ownership interest? Desmond's confidence was crumbling. Slowly, his brain tried to piece it all together, but he refused to accept what was becoming more obvious. He had spat on someone who owned his life. Later that evening, he returned home earlier than usual. Adana was in the sitting room quietly reading a novel. Desmond looked at her, his face twitching with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "Did you report me to my office?" he asked flatly. She looked up slowly. "No," she replied. "I didn't need to." Her answer was calm, disarming, terrifying. Desmond's voice rose. "Then who the hell is dragging my name through the mud? Who is trying to destroy my reputation?" Adana didn't blink. Maybe it's not destruction. Maybe it's revelation. Desmond clenched his fists. "You think you're smart, ABI? You're behind this. You've always been jealous of my success." Adana stood and faced him. "Your success?" she asked softly. "Which part? The part my father paid for? Or the part you used to insult him at dinner?" The words hit Desmond like bullets. "You're what?" he croaked. But before she could say more, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and said quietly, "Excuse me. It's my father." Then she walked into the room, leaving Desmond staring at the wall, speechless, and for the first time, afraid. Desmond remained frozen in the living room long after Adana stepped into the bedroom to take her call. The weight of her final words, "It's my father," rang louder than the ticking wall clock or the distant hum of the generator. Something about the way she said it, so calm and without fear, made his blood run cold. For the first time, Desmond realized he had no idea who his wife really was. He had spent years underestimating her, thinking of her as a mere housewife with no background, no power, no pedigree. But what if she had been hiding more than her quiet nature? What if he had married into something far deeper than he could comprehend? He got up and began pacing the room, gripping the edge of the sofa like it could hold him upright. His mind raced. Who was Chief Leopold? How could that man be connected to his wife? Why did HR call him a silent owner? The more he thought, the more paranoid he became. And paranoia, for a man like Desmond, was gasoline to his temper. When Adana returned to the living room, Desmond was waiting like a boiling kettle. "You've been playing me this whole time," he said, voice low but sharp. She said nothing, only moved to sit down. "Your father, that man. You knew what you were doing when you invited him here. You wanted to humiliate me." Still, she was silent. Her silence stung him more than any insult. "You pretended to be poor. You let me carry this whole family thinking I was the one in control. You made me look like a fool." Adana looked up at him then, her eyes tired, her voice steady. You didn't need my help to look like a fool, Desmond. You managed that all by yourself. That was the moment something inside him snapped. He stepped toward her, face darkening. Don't test me, Adana. Don't push me. I'm still your husband. She stood as well, not in challenge, but in self-respect. Then act like it, she whispered. Because the way you treat me, even a stranger, would have more dignity. Desmond's hand twitched at his side, itching to lash out, but something in her gaze stopped him. Not fear. Not even anger. It was the look of someone who had outgrown you. The rest of the evening simmered with a dangerous silence. Desmond retreated to the bedroom, slamming the door behind him. Adana stayed in the sitting room, curled up on the sofa, holding a throw pillow against her chest like armor. She wasn't scared, not in the usual sense. But she was deeply aware of the storm building inside her husband. She had lived through the mockery, the pride, the subtle emotional abuse. But now it was becoming physical, and her heart knew it was only a matter of time. Still, she refused to be the first to flee. She had been through too much to be chased from her own home. That night, she barely slept. And in the dark, she whispered a silent prayer. Lord, let the truth finish what love could not. Upstairs, Desmond stared at the ceiling in the darkness, unable to rest, replaying every insult he'd ever thrown at his wife, now realizing, far too late, that the woman he had trampled may be standing on ground far higher than he could ever reach. The next morning arrived like a slap to Desmond's face, and not just metaphorically. His alarm buzzed at 6:30 a.m., but for once, he didn't leap out of bed with energy. He lay there staring at the ceiling, mind racing, stomach sour with anxiety. Something was off. No text from HR. No calls. No updates. Just silence. He finally got up, dressed slowly, and left the house without eating. As he drove through the streets of Lagos, his eyes darted to every billboard, every pedestrian, every company logo, suddenly feeling like the whole city was watching him. When he arrived at the office, the receptionist barely looked up. "Good morning, Mr. Obi," she said with a bland tone reserved for strangers. The usual warm greetings from junior staff were absent. Even the security man at the gate, who usually gave a thumbs up, simply waved him in coldly. He walked toward his office, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if his reputation had died overnight and only the corpse remained. The first blow came before he even sat down. His company email access had been revoked. His system showed access denied. He called IT, but no one picked up. He went down to the HR floor, only to find his ID card had been flagged. He had to be escorted in. Inside, the HR director was waiting, her face unreadable. "Please sit," she said. "We need to talk." Desmond's mouth went dry. "Why is my access blocked?" he asked. The director folded her hands. "As part of your performance review, and due to the ongoing internal audit ordered by Mr. Leopold Nwankwo, we've been advised to restrict your administrative controls until further notice." Desmond's eyes widened. "You mean that man really owns this company?" The director raised an eyebrow. "You spat on him, Mr. Obi. You insulted the man who pays your salary." Desmond jumped to his feet. "Nobody told me. Nobody said he was." She cut him off. "You didn't ask. And even if you didn't know, your behavior has consistently violated the code of conduct. You're not being punished just for the spit, Mr. Obi. That was just the match. The fuel was already there." By the time he left the building, Desmond's legs were shaking. He had been told that a formal decision about his employment would be made within the next 72 hours, pending review by the board. In the meantime, he was placed on administrative leave. No access. No benefits. No salary. He got into his car and sat behind the steering wheel, hands trembling, throat dry. Everything he had built, or thought he had built, was crumbling beneath his feet. And worst of all, it wasn't because of sabotage. It was because the truth was finally catching up. He had walked through the world like a god, mocking others, belittling his wife, stepping on people he thought were beneath him. Now, the very ground was rejecting him. As he turned the ignition, he muttered to himself, "This can't be happening. I'm Desmond Obi." But Lagos didn't care. The world didn't care. And soon, even his name wouldn't matter. Desmond returned home early, but unlike previous days, there was no swagger in his step. He dragged himself through the front door like a wounded animal, dropped his bag on the floor, and sat on the edge of the sofa without removing his shoes. Adana emerged from the hallway with folded laundry in her hands. She paused, studied him quietly, then resumed walking to the bedroom. "Where are you going?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. She stopped. "To put your clothes away," she said. "I don't need your pity," he spat. "I didn't offer it," she replied, without turning around. Something about her composure made Desmond feel like a boy again, not in innocence, but in smallness. He was losing control, not just at work, but in his home. The walls were closing in, and his usual weapons, arrogance, sarcasm, intimidation, had stopped working. He stood up and followed her into the room. "Why didn't you ever tell me who your father was?" he asked. She placed the folded shirts in the drawer before answering. "Because I wanted to know if you'd love me without it." Her answer punched the air out of his lungs. He sat on the bed, eyes distant. "So all this time you were rich?" She nodded. "Rich isn't the word. Safe. Protected. But I gave it up to build something real with you. I wanted to know if love without money could survive." Desmond scoffed. "So now what? You think you're better than me?" She turned to him, her expression firm. "No. I think I've always been better than who you chose to become." The words silenced him. He didn't expect them to hurt so much. And yet, they echoed louder than a scream. "I built this house," he said defensively. "You paid for it," she corrected. "But I was the one scrubbing floors, cooking meals, enduring your insults. I was your wife, not your maid." Desmond stood up, frustration bubbling in his chest. "I've had enough of this righteous talk. I may have made mistakes, but don't act like I'm a monster." Adana crossed her arms. "If you were truly a man, you'd reflect. Instead, you're looking for someone to blame." That was when his hand twitched again. Not yet a slap, but the storm was coming. That night, Desmond sat in the dark living room, staring at his own reflection in the mirror above the TV. He didn't like what he saw, not because of guilt, but because he finally saw it weakness. A man with no power. A man exposed. The illusion of control was gone. He had mocked others to feel superior, belittled his wife to feel strong, spat on a man who owned his future. And now the mirror was showing him who he really was. A coward. A fraud. He turned away, unable to bear it. Meanwhile, in the guest room, Adana sat by the window, staring at the moonlight. She had done her part. She had endured, prayed, loved, and hoped. But now, her silence was ending. Not with screams or fights, but with truth. The truth that no longer needed defending. Because when truth is finally free, the only thing left to fall is pride. Desmond arrived at the office 3 days later, wearing his most expensive native attire. A deep blue agbada embroidered in silver, polished black loafers, and a confident smirk he forced onto his face like armor. But inside, he was drowning. The days of suspension had been hell. No calls from HR. No updates from his team. And no one at the office returned his messages. Even Kechi had gone quiet, suddenly unavailable for her usual morning gossip. Still, he believed this was all a misunderstanding, a storm that would pass if he simply faced it with pride. He walked into the building expecting to defend himself, maybe grovel a little, and then get reinstated. But what greeted him on the top floor was something he hadn't anticipated, something that knocked the air from his lungs before anyone said a word. The boardroom was unusually full. Every executive sat in their formal seats, files closed in front of them, as if waiting for a final exam to begin. But what startled Desmond most wasn't the room's silence. It was the man standing near the head of the table, dressed in a flawless gray suit and speaking softly to the chairman. Desmond's legs nearly gave out. It was him, the old man, the same man he had spat on. But now he wasn't wearing plain kaftan and slippers. He stood tall, clean-shaven, commanding, the presence of a lion among cubs. Chief Leopold turned, and their eyes met. Desmond's lips parted, but no sound came out. The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Desmond Obi, Meet Chief Leopold Nwankwo, the silent majority shareholder and founder of this company. A thick silence followed. No one laughed. No one moved. Desmond felt the weight of shame, like chains on his shoulders. This was no village old man. This was the man who had built everything Desmond claimed to own. And he had spat on him. Chief Leopold didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse or gloat. He simply opened a folder and placed a letter on the table. "This is your final evaluation, Mr. Obi," he said. "Effective immediately. Your services are no longer required in this company." Desmond stumbled forward. "Sir." "Chief, please, I didn't know." "I didn't mean to." But the chief raised a hand gently, and Desmond froze. "That's the point," he said. "You didn't know who I was. And that's when your true nature showed. You disrespected a stranger. You mocked the powerless. And you hit the woman who covered your shame in silence." Desmond fell to his knees. "Please, I beg you." But Chief Leopold turned to the board. "Escort him out." The security men stepped forward. And as they led Desmond out of the room, his agbada dragging like a discarded robe, the other staff lowered their eyes. Not in respect, but in shame for the man they once called boss. The sun outside the building was unforgiving, beating down on Desmond as he stood dazed by the parking lot, trying to process what had just happened. His mouth was dry. His ears rang. The very ground beneath his feet felt like it had shifted permanently. He had been fired. No, humiliated. Stripped of everything. And what burned more than the dismissal itself was that it came with no fight, no loud confrontation. Just a calm, signed letter, and a soft-spoken man with the power to collapse his entire world with a sentence. Desmond staggered toward his car, unlocked it with trembling fingers, and collapsed behind the steering wheel. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there, drenched in sweat and panic, staring at the side mirror where a reflection of his broken self stared back at him. He had worked so hard for this status, or so he thought. But now he realized. He had climbed a ladder his wife had held up for him. And the moment she let go, he fell. Back home, Adana sat in the quiet sitting room, arranging the last set of documents her father had sent her. Copies of the car's ownership papers, the house deed, even the business certificate Desmond thought he opened with his savings. All of it had her name on it. All of it was gifted, protected, and preserved by her father. But she never flaunted it, never used it to control him. She had loved Desmond genuinely, at first. She had believed in him, encouraged him, supported him in every silent way. But love cannot grow where there is no respect. And Desmond had turned their home into a temple of pride, built on her silent sacrifices. Now, the silence was ending. When she heard his car pull up, she folded the papers and returned them to her drawer. She didn't prepare dinner. She didn't even meet him at the door. She simply waited calmly for the man who once barked commands to return home stripped of his imagined royalty. Desmond stumbled into the house like a ghost, his agbada soaked in sweat, his shoes scuffed. His eyes scanned the living room as if trying to recognize it. He stood silently for a moment, unsure whether to speak, apologize, scream, or cry. Adana didn't say a word. She watched him like one watches a stranger pass by. He dropped his car key on the floor and fell onto the couch. "They fired me," he mumbled. "The whole company, they all watched, and he, your father," his voice cracked. Adana looked at him, eyes void of pity. "You fired yourself the day you forgot how to treat people," she said. "The day you spat on a man because you thought he was nothing." Desmond shook his head. "Please, I need you to talk to him for me. You can fix this. Just tell him." She stood up. "He told me never to speak for you again. He said your actions will speak for you now." And then she walked away, leaving him drowning in the silence he created. The next day crawled by like a funeral march. Desmond barely moved from the couch. He didn't eat. He didn't bathe. He just sat there, staring at the blank television, as if willing it to show him a version of his life that hadn't been destroyed. But all he saw was nothingness, the same emptiness that now echoed in his chest. When Adana emerged from the bedroom in the late afternoon, dressed neatly and carrying a small bag, his eyes darted to her. "Where are you going?" he asked. She didn't respond. She reached for her phone and car key, but he stood and blocked her path. "Adana, please," he said, voice trembling. "You can't just leave me like this. Not after everything we've been through." She looked at him, eyes tired but sharp. "Everything I went through, you mean?" she replied. "You went through nothing but ego trips and false glory." He stepped closer, desperate. "Why are you doing this? Why are you acting like I'm the villain?" That was the moment she turned fully to face him, voice calm but steady. "You raised your voice at me for years. You called me useless. You mocked my family. You spat on my father. You lied to yourself and convinced others that you were something you never earned. You climbed on my back and then whipped me for being beneath you." Her voice cracked slightly but never faltered. "So yes, Desmond, you are the villain. And now the mask has fallen." Desmond's face contorted, rage bubbling beneath his skin. "You think you're so holy now? So righteous? You think your father's money makes you better than me?" She stepped back. "It never did. But my silence made you think you were better than me. That was your mistake." Desmond lunged forward and shouted, "You ungrateful!" And then he slapped her. Hard. The room fell silent. Her head jerked sideways from the force, and she staggered backward, dropping her bag. Just then, at that precise moment, the front door opened. A shadow filled the entrance. Chief Leopold Nwankwo stood there, briefcase in hand, having come to collect his daughter personally. His eyes fell on the scene. Adana rubbing her cheek, tears silently falling. Desmond still standing with his palm raised. And for a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then Chief Leopold's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You just signed your final receipt," he said coldly. Desmond's lips parted, but no words came out. The chief stepped inside, slowly. "I came here to offer you one last opportunity, one last show of decency. But now I won't speak. I'll act." He turned to Adana. "My daughter, are you ready?" She picked up her bag without a word, walked past Desmond like he was furniture, and stood beside her father. Together they walked out, while Desmond stood in a house no longer his, surrounded by silence, broken pride, and the echo of a slap that changed everything. The silence that filled the room after Adana and her father left was not the kind of silence that comforted or soothed. It was the kind that suffocated, the kind that wrapped itself around Desmond's throat and refused to let go. He remained standing for a long time, his hand still slightly raised, as if even his own body refused to accept what had just happened. The sting of the slap had vanished from Adana's cheek, but its consequence now burned into Desmond's soul. Slowly, he turned and collapsed onto the sofa, burying his face in his palms. For a man who prided himself on control, dominance, and power, the last 5 days had stripped him down to nothing but a shell. And now, with the look in Chief Leopold's eyes still haunting him, he knew the final nail had been driven into his coffin. There would be no going back from this. Not this time. Across town, Adana sat in her father's car, her hands trembling in her lap as they drove in silence. The slap still echoed in her head, not because of the pain, but because of what it represented. That was the line. That was the moment where everything broke. Years of mockery, manipulation, and emotional bruises had finally bled into a physical wound. And yet, she didn't cry. Not anymore. She had wept enough for a lifetime in that house. Her father didn't speak either. He simply reached out at a red light, placed his hand gently over hers, and squeezed. It was the first touch of comfort she had received in years. And it reminded her that love, real love, was not supposed to hurt, humiliate, or destroy. It was supposed to build, to protect, to heal. And now that she was out, she would never again tolerate the kind of love that left scars instead of safety. By the time they reached the quiet estate in Ikoyi, Adana had already made up her mind. She wouldn't go back, not even if Desmond came crawling, not even if he fell on his knees and begged. Some men only learn respect after they've lost what they took for granted. And even then, it's not because they've changed, but because they've been exposed. Her father opened the gate and led her inside. Everything was peaceful. The air smelled of mango trees and soft flowers. The walls were clean. Her childhood room was still untouched. As she stepped in, it felt like the arms of the house wrapped around her. She set down her bag and sat on the edge of the bed. Her father leaned against the door and said, "I should have stopped it earlier, but I needed you to see him for yourself." She nodded, finally allowing the tears to fall, not from pain, but from relief. "Thank you, Daddy. You came just in time." And for the first time in years, Adana slept soundly, no longer a prisoner in her own home. Desmond didn't leave the house the next day, or the day after. He couldn't. Not when the shame was still fresh, still loud in his ears like a bell tolling for his lost pride. He sat by the window, watching the street as if expecting the world to come and take more from him. But the world had already taken everything. Or rather, he had handed it away, one insult at a time, one arrogant step at a time. His phone buzzed nonstop, but he didn't dare look. Social media was on fire. The news had broken that morning. Disgraced former department head terminated after assault allegations and corporate misconduct investigation. The article didn't name him directly, but the comment section made it clear everyone knew. Anonymous blog posts leaked snippets of the story. The slap, the dinner, the silent billionaire CEO who had finally revealed himself. Even his neighbors began to whisper. The gate man no longer greeted him. The world was watching, and it was not clapping. But what stung more than the news was the silence from Adana. No calls, no texts, no sign she was even thinking about him. He had expected anger, rage, a fight. But what he got was nothing. And somehow, that nothingness was the most painful response of all. Nkechi, his ever-loyal sister, had vanished too. Perhaps she had seen the writing on the wall and fled before the house fell completely. Or perhaps she was ashamed. Either way, Desmond was alone. Alone with his thoughts, his ruined name, and the realization that everything he had built was constructed on the back of someone else's sacrifice, a woman he never respected, and a father-in-law he had spat on. He thought of going to them, of apologizing. But what could he say that wouldn't sound hollow? He had crossed too many lines. He had burnt the bridge, danced on the ashes, and only now realized there was no way back. Meanwhile, Chief Leopold released a brief but cutting press statement. It read, "Respect is not earned by title, but by character. Any man who cannot honor his home has no place in my empire." It trended for 2 days straight. Women praised him. Men debated him. HR departments across the city hosted seminars quoting his words. And Desmond? He became a cautionary tale. Former colleagues whispered behind his back, friends stopped picking his calls, and job offers vanished like smoke. One evening, he received an email from a client. "Due to recent allegations, we regret to inform you that our contract with you is nullified." He didn't even reply. What was there to say? He had spent years building a castle out of sand, crowned himself king, and spat on the very stone that could have been his foundation. And now, not even the mud remained. Adana woke to the sound of birds chirping and morning light spilling across her curtains. It felt surreal to be back in her father's house, not as a little girl visiting during holidays, but as a woman who had been to war and returned scarred but whole. She sat up, stretched, and looked around at the quiet elegance of her room. Nothing extravagant, just warmth, peace, and dignity. Her father had given her space to rest, and now that she had slept, she was ready to live. She rose, showered, and dressed in a soft green Ankara gown before stepping out into the veranda, where her father waited with 2 mugs of steaming tea. "You slept well," he said, without looking up from his newspaper. She nodded, like someone released from prison. He smiled. "That's because you were. A prison doesn't always have bars. Sometimes it has walls made of silence and disrespect." She sipped her tea, letting the truth of his words sink in. Later that day, Adana accompanied him to one of his smaller companies, a startup hub focused on empowering young women in tech. She had always been passionate about helping others, and her father believed it was time she stepped into her own. "You've lived in the background long enough," he told her. "Now it's time to take up space." At the office, she was introduced as the new executive director. The staff were stunned. They had heard of her, but never seen her. And now, she stood in front of them not as a boss's daughter, not as someone hiding her identity, but as a woman who had earned her seat through quiet endurance. She gave her first staff speech that day, a powerful, calm declaration of what dignity meant. "You don't need to raise your voice to be heard," she said. "Sometimes, the strongest response is to walk away with your head held high." The room clapped, not out of duty, but from respect. Adana was no longer invisible. That evening, back at the estate, her father handed her a file. It contained all the documents tying Desmond's name to things he thought he owned: the house, the car, even the small side business he had bragged about. "Do you want to reclaim them formally?" her father asked. She looked through the papers for a long while, then shook her head. "No. Let him keep the ruins. Let him hold on to what he thinks is wealth." Her father raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" She smiled, serene. "Yes. Because I didn't leave empty-handed. I left with my peace, my purpose, and my power. That's more than he'll ever understand." And with that, she placed the documents back into the envelope, walked out to the garden, and sat among the hibiscus flowers as the sun dipped into the horizon. She wasn't planning revenge. She wasn't chasing pity. She was simply free. Desmond sat on the floor of his living room, surrounded by silence and unpaid bills. The furniture had lost its shine, and the air smelled stale, like something decaying slowly from the inside out. The electricity had been disconnected 2 days ago. The fridge was empty. His phone buzzed with debt reminders, bounced bank alerts, and job rejections. For the first time in his life, Desmond Obi truly understood the meaning of being alone. Nkechi was gone. She'd packed her bags and left quietly after a heated argument where she had the audacity to say, "Even I didn't know you were this useless." His friends no longer visited. Most had turned their backs after the public disgrace. He called some of them in desperation, but their responses were all the same. "Bro, I just manage myself, or worse. No be that slap and spitting guy." A big shift. He had become a meme, a shameful viral joke. And no one pities a meme. The house, the same house he once bragged about, was under investigation for fraudulent acquisition. Apparently, several documents were linked to a trust owned by LN Holdings, and since Desmond had failed to meet certain conditions outlined in the confidential agreement, he was now liable for breach. The lawyers called. Then came the bank. Then the eviction notice. He laughed bitterly when the landlord's agent came knocking and said, "Sir, we were unaware the property was only subleased through proxy ownership. You have 14 days to vacate." Desmond didn't argue. What was the point? Even his car had been repossessed due to unpaid installments. The very car he had believed was a gift to himself, not realizing it had been quietly maintained by Adana's father through a shadow fund. It was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Every lie he built his pride on was now a heap of ash. He finally gathered the courage to call Adana. Just once. Her number rang. Once. Twice. Then voicemail. He tried again. This time, the call connected, but no one spoke. He whispered, "Adana, please. I'm sorry. I'm not the man I used to be. Please, just talk to me." But still, there was silence. Then a soft click. The line went dead. She had blocked him. For good. He slumped to the floor, shaking, not just from grief, but from the horrifying realization that he had destroyed something pure. Adana had been his lifeline, his dignity, the voice of reason in the madness of Lagos. And he hadn't just lost her. He had thrown her away like trash. Now, all that remained was the echo of his arrogance and the memory of a woman who once gave him everything and asked for nothing. He buried his face in his hands, and for the first time in years, Desmond Obi cried like a child. 6 months later, the city of Lagos buzzed with its usual rhythm. Horns honking, sellers shouting, street hawkers weaving through traffic. But within a well-marbled event hall in Victoria Island, a quiet celebration was taking place. Women from all walks of life gathered to honor the new face of female leadership in enterprise, Adana Nwankwo, Executive Director of LN Group Women's Innovation Hub. Dressed in a sleek ivory gown with gold accents, she stood on the stage with calm poise, giving a keynote speech that would be shared across thousands of platforms later that night. Dignity, she said, is not about power. It's about peace. And when a woman chooses peace over performance, the world shifts. The applause was thunderous, but Adana didn't flinch. She simply smiled, bowed slightly, and stepped down from a stage into a new life, one that no longer required her to shrink herself for anyone else's pride. After the ceremony, she sat with her father beneath the garden canopy outside the hall, sipping champagne. He looked at her with deep pride. "You've grown into everything your mother prayed for," he said. "And more." Adana chuckled. "I only wish she lived to see this." He nodded. "She sees. Every time you choose silence over chaos, truth over control, grace over revenge, she sees." A long pause followed. Then he asked, "Have you heard from him?" She shook her head. "Not directly. I heard he's squatting in an old friend's boys' quarters, jobless, broke, and still bitter." Her father's eyes narrowed. "Would you want to press charges for the slap?" Adana looked up at the stars and thought deeply. Then she said, "No. Let life teach him better than the courts ever could." Sometimes the most painful justice is the absence of a second chance. Her father smiled, not with satisfaction, but with understanding. There are victories louder than revenge. This was one of them. A week later, while attending a small charity event in Surulere, Adana passed by a street corner near a mechanic workshop. She spotted a familiar figure bent over a broken-down car, hair unkempt, shirt stained, skin darker from sun exposure. It was Desmond. Their eyes met briefly. He froze. She didn't stop. She didn't frown. She didn't even flinch. She simply walked past with a smile, carrying a box of donations in her hand, surrounded by people who respected her. Behind her, Desmond lowered his gaze, suddenly ashamed of his own reflection in a puddle of engine oil. That was the last time their paths crossed. And as Adana drove away that afternoon, windows down, breeze in her hair, she whispered a prayer, not for him, but for herself. "Thank you, Lord, for setting me free." She never looked back. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.